The oxygen machine hummed a steady, rhythmic pulse that felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. I sat by the bedside, clutching my mother's hand, a hand that once kneaded dough with effortless strength but now felt like a bundle of dry parchment. This wasn't just the end of a long illness, it was the end of an era for our family. My mother, Margaret, was the keeper of every secret, the glue that held 3 generations of pride and stubbornness together. As her breathing grew shallow, my brothers stood at the foot of the bed, their eyes darting toward the vintage mahogany vanity in the corner. They weren't just here to mourn, they were here for the inheritance. For weeks, the tension in the house had been thick enough to choke on. My brothers believed there was a stash of family heirlooms or a hidden deed, something that would solve their mounting debts. But I was the only one who truly cared about her comfort. Suddenly, Margaret's eyes snapped open, a piercing, lucid blue I hadn't seen in months. She gripped my wrist with a strength that defied her frail frame. The room seemed to grow cold as she pulled me closer, her lips brushing against my ear. The boys stepped forward, their greed almost palpable in the dim light. "What is she saying, Sarah?" my oldest brother, Thomas, demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anxiety and avarice. I ignored him, leaning in further until I could smell the faint scent of lavender and peppermint that always followed her. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely a ghost of a sound, but the words were clear. She didn't talk about money. She didn't talk about the house. Instead, she whispered a sentence that made my heart stop and my blood turn to ice. "The treasure isn't in the walls, Sarah. Look under the floorboards of the old chapel, but do not let your brothers see what's inside." Before I could ask what she meant, her hand went limp and the monitor let out a long, haunting, continuous beep. My brothers lunged toward the bed, but I was already reeling from the realization that my mother had been hiding a secret that could destroy us all. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and stifled sobs, but my mind was miles away, trapped in that final, chilling whisper. Thomas and Elias were already making plans to strip the house, their grief conveniently replaced by a frantic need to inventory Margaret's possessions. They didn't know about the old chapel, a crumbling stone structure on the edge of the family property that had been abandoned for decades. It was a place we were strictly forbidden from playing in as children. Now, I understood why. That night, under the cover of a torrential downpour, I slipped out of the back door with a heavy flashlight and a crowbar hidden beneath my coat. The woods were thick with mud, and every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the countryside. I reached the chapel, its arched windows looking like hollow eyes in the darkness. The door groaned on rusted hinges as I pushed inside, the air smelling of damp earth and ancient dust. I scanned the floor, looking for any sign of a loose board, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found it near the altar, a section of wood that didn't quite line up with the rest. As I jammed the crowbar into the crevice, the wood shrieked in protest. I poured every ounce of my strength into the lever, gasping as the floorboard finally popped upward. Tucked into the dark earth beneath was an iron-bound box, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the rot. My hands shook as I reached for it, but just as my fingers grazed the cold metal, a heavy beam of light cut through the darkness from the doorway. "We knew you were hiding something, Sarah," Thomas's voice boomed, dripping with a terrifying new level of menace. I looked up to see both of my brothers standing there, and in Thomas's hand, the light caught the glint of a hunting knife. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the stone walls, but Thomas and Elias didn't move. They looked like strangers, their faces twisted by a desperate hunger for wealth I couldn't comprehend. "Mom told you where it was, didn't she?" Elias hissed, stepping into the circle of light. "She always liked you best. Always gave you the secrets while we got the scraps." I clutched the iron-bound box to my chest, feeling its unexpected weight. It didn't feel like gold or jewelry, it felt like something much more substantial, much more dangerous. "This isn't what you think it is," I pleaded, backing away toward the crumbling altar. "She warned me. She said you couldn't see what was inside." Thomas laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "Because she wanted it all for you. Move aside, Sarah." We've had enough of being the family disappointments. If there's a deed in that box, or the location of the offshore accounts, we're taking it. He lunged forward, and I scrambled backward, tripping over a fallen stone. The box flew from my hands, skidding across the dusty floor. We all froze as the lid creaked open upon impact. It didn't spill out gold coins or diamonds. Instead, a thick stack of yellowed envelopes and a heavy, leather-bound ledger tumbled out. But it was what lay beneath the papers that caught the light, a tarnished silver locket with a crest none of us recognized, and a photograph of our mother as a young woman, standing next to a man who was definitely not our father. As Thomas reached for the photo, the ground beneath the chapel began to groan. A sudden, violent tremor shook the foundation, and the floorboards near the altar began to collapse into a dark, yawning pit. The floor. I screamed, but it was too late. Elias was standing right on the edge of the fracture. The sound of splintering wood and shifting earth drowned out Elias's cry as he disappeared into the darkness. Elias! Thomas screamed, dropping the knife and diving toward the hole. I scrambled to my feet, the iron box forgotten for a moment as I rushed to help. Below us, in a shallow basement we never knew existed, Elias lay groaning among the debris. The flashlight beam revealed something even more shocking than the hidden room. The walls below were lined with rows upon rows of filing cabinets and sturdy wooden crates, all marked with a government seal that had been expired for 50 years. This wasn't a hidden treasury, it was an archive. My mother hadn't been a simple grandmother who spent her days knitting and baking, she had been someone entirely different. I climbed down the jagged edge of the floor, reaching Elias and checking his vitals. He was bruised and shaken, but alive. Thomas followed, his greed momentarily eclipsed by the sheer confusion of our surroundings. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice small. I walked over to the nearest crate and pried it open. Inside were hundreds of blueprints and classified documents detailing the construction of a local dam, the same dam that had accidentally flooded our town 40 years ago, killing dozens of families. I realized then that my mother's treasure was actually a burden, the evidence of a massive cover-up that had shaped our entire region. My mother had been the whistleblower who never spoke, the guardian of a truth that could bring down the most powerful families in the state. "If this gets out," I whispered, flipping through a ledger filled with payoff amounts and names of judges, "people will go to prison. Even now." Suddenly, we heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. Multiple vehicles were pulling up to the abandoned chapel. A spotlight swept across the broken windows, and a voice over a megaphone commanded, "This is the sheriff's department. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and leave the archive behind." The panic in the room was instantaneous. "The sheriff?" Elias gasped, clutching his injured leg. "How did they know?" I looked at the documents in my hand and then at the staircase leading back up to the chapel floor. If the sheriff was here, it wasn't to rescue us, it was to ensure the secrets stayed buried. Our town's sheriff was the grandson of the man listed at the top of the payoff ledger. We weren't being arrested, we were being silenced. "We can't go out there," I said, my mind racing. "If we walk out with this, we're dead. If we leave it, they'll burn the chapel down with us in it." Thomas, usually the bravest of us, looked paralyzed. The greed that had driven him hours ago had vanished, replaced by the cold reality of a life-or-death situation. "There has to be another way out," he stammered. I began frantically searching the walls of the basement, my flashlight flickering. In the far corner, behind a stack of crates, I saw a heavy iron grate, a drainage tunnel that likely led toward the river. "Help me move these," I hissed. The three of us, bonded by a sudden, desperate need to survive, shoved the heavy crates aside. The metal grate was rusted shut, but with Thomas's knife and my crowbar, we began to pry at the edges. Outside, we heard the heavy thud of boots hitting the chapel floor above us. They were inside. "Find them," the sheriff's voice echoed from above. "And make sure nothing leaves this hole." As the grate finally gave way, revealing a dark, wet tunnel, I realized I had to make a choice. I grabbed the iron-bound box, shoving the most important ledgers inside. Just as I lowered myself into the tunnel, a pair of boots appeared at the edge of the hole above us. I looked up and saw the sheriff peering down, his service weapon drawn and aimed directly at my head. The roar of the sheriff's handgun echoed like a cannon blast in the confined basement. The bullet slammed into a wooden crate inches from my ear, showering me with splinters. "Move. Now!" I screamed to my brothers, shoving the iron-bound box into the dark, slick mouth of the drainage tunnel. Thomas scrambled in first, pulling a limping Elias behind him. I dove in last, my stomach churning as I slid into the freezing, stagnant water. Behind us, I heard the sheriff shouting for his deputies to find the tunnel's exit. The tunnel was narrow, smelling of wet earth and ancient rot. We crawled on our hands and knees, the only light coming from my flickering flashlight. My brothers, once divided by greed, were now huddled close, their breathing ragged and terrified. "Sarah, why did Mom keep this?" Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "She lived like a pauper while sitting on evidence that could have made her a fortune, or saved the town." I didn't have the answer yet. I only knew that she had chosen to be a silent guardian, perhaps waiting for a day when we were strong enough to handle the truth. After what felt like miles of crawling, the tunnel began to slope upward. The sound of rushing water grew louder. We reached a heavy iron mesh at the end of the pipe that overlooked the rain-swollen river. We were trapped. The mesh was bolted into the concrete, and the river below was a churning vortex of mud and debris. Suddenly, the light of a powerful searchlight hit the pipe from across the bank. "They're in the drain," a voice shouted. Through the mesh, I saw the sheriff's cruiser skidding to a halt on the muddy road above the bank. He stepped out, silhouetted by his headlights, and began to reload his weapon. We were sitting ducks, pinned between a locked cage and a killer, with the evidence of a 40-year-old crime clutched in my trembling arms. "We have to jump," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. I looked at the raging river, then back at the tunnel behind us where we could hear the deputies approaching. "The fall will kill us, and the current is too strong," I argued. But Thomas was already kicking at the rusted mesh with his heavy work boots. "It's the river or the sheriff, Sarah. At least the river doesn't have a badge and a gun." With a final, desperate heave, the rusted bolts gave way. The mesh tumbled into the abyss, disappearing instantly into the white foam. Thomas grabbed Elias by the collar. "Hold your breath," he yelled, and before I could protest, they vanished into the darkness. I stood at the edge, the iron box tucked under one arm. I looked back one last time. The beam of the sheriff's flashlight was reflecting off the tunnel walls just a few yards away. I closed my eyes, thought of my mother's final whisper, and stepped into the void. The impact with the water felt like hitting a brick wall. The cold was an immediate, paralyzing shock that sucked the air from my lungs. I tumbled through the dark water, the weight of the iron box pulling me down. I fought the urge to let it go, kicking frantically until my head broke the surface. I gasped for air, swept away by the current. I could see my brothers' heads bobbing ahead of me, but the river was pulling us toward the old dam, the very structure mentioned in the classified documents. The massive concrete wall loomed in the distance like a tombstone. If we hit the overflow gates, we would be crushed. But as we drifted closer, I noticed a small, wooden dock tucked behind a bend in the river, and standing on it was a figure holding a lantern, a figure that looked impossibly like the man in the photograph I had seen in the box. The man on the dock moved with a frantic urgency, casting a thick rope out into the current. "Grab the line," he bellowed, his voice deep and weathered. Thomas caught it first, wrapping it around his arm and pulling Elias toward the wooden pilings. I struggled against the pull of the dam, my muscles screaming with fatigue. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the rope. The man hauled us in one by one, his face lined with years of hardship and secrets. Up close, the resemblance to the man in the photo was undeniable. He hurried us into a small, camouflaged cabin hidden in the thick brush along the riverbank. Inside, a wood stove flickered, providing the first bit of warmth I'd felt since the funeral. "You're Margaret's children," the man said, not as a question, but as a fact. He looked at the iron box in my arms and sighed. "She told me this day would come. She hoped it wouldn't, but she knew the sheriff's family wouldn't let the past stay buried forever." "Who are you?" I demanded, shivering as Elias tended to his leg. The man sat down, his eyes fixed on the silver locket that had fallen out of the box. "My name is Arthur. I was the lead engineer on that dam 40 years ago. Your mother and I, we tried to stop them. We found the flaws in the foundation, the shortcuts the county took to line their pockets. They threatened to kill us both. To protect you kids, Margaret made a deal. She would keep the evidence hidden and stay silent, and in exchange, they would let her, and you, live." My heart broke as I realized the sacrifice my mother had made. She hadn't been a quiet, boring grandmother by choice, she had lived in a self-imposed prison of silence to keep us safe. But Arthur's expression suddenly darkened as he looked toward the window. "The sheriff didn't just follow you to the chapel. He's been tracking the GPS in your mother's locket. He's outside." We doused the lanterns instantly, the cabin falling into a terrifying darkness. Outside, the sound of the rain was punctuated by the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. "Arthur, you have to take the box," I whispered, pushing it toward him. "You're the engineer. You can explain the technicalities to the federal authorities." Arthur shook his head, his hand resting on mine. "No, Sarah. I've lived in hiding for 40 years. I'm a ghost. The world won't listen to a dead man. They'll listen to the grieving daughter of a local hero. You are the only one who can finish what your mother started." Thomas stood by the door, clutching a heavy iron poker from the stove. "We're not running anymore," he said, looking at Elias and then at me. The greed that had nearly destroyed our family had been replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. We were no longer fighting over an inheritance, we were fighting for our mother's legacy. Suddenly, the front door was kicked open with a violent crash. The sheriff stepped in, his face a mask of cold fury, his gun leveled at Arthur. "Give me the box, and maybe I'll let the kids go," he growled. I stepped forward into the line of fire, holding the box high. "It's over," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my knees. "We know everything. We know about the dam, the payoffs, and your grandfather. And we aren't the only ones." I held up my phone. The screen showed a livestream connection with over 1,000 viewers. I had started the broadcast the moment we entered the cabin. The sheriff froze, his eyes darting to the phone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He couldn't kill a secret that was already out in the world. But his desperation was reaching a breaking point. He tightened his grip on the trigger, his knuckles white. "I'll kill you all anyway," he snarled, starting with the old man. The sheriff never got the chance. The sound of sirens, real sirens, not the local deputies, wailed in the distance. Federal marshals, tipped off by the viral broadcast and the documents I had scanned and uploaded while in the tunnel, were swarming the property. The sheriff slumped, the weight of his family's sins finally crushing him. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees as the cabin was flooded with light. The nightmare that had haunted my mother for 4 decades was finally over. In the weeks that followed, the truth about the dam came to light. The powerful families who had built their empires on the lives of others were brought to justice. Our town began a long process of healing, and the victims of the flood finally received the recognition they deserved. Thomas and Elias changed, too. The treasure they had sought, gold and land, seemed hollow compared to the bond we had forged in that chapel and the river. They used their portion of the legal settlement to start a foundation in our mother's name, helping families who had been displaced by corporate greed. I returned to my mother's house one last time before selling it. I sat in her old rocking chair, looking at the silver locket. I finally understood the treasure of the elder. It wasn't the secrets in the basement or the classified documents. The true treasure was the quiet strength it took to protect those you love, even if it meant being misunderstood by the very people you were saving. My mother had carried a mountain on her shoulders so that we could walk on level ground. As I closed the door to the house, I whispered the words I should have said years ago. I understand now, Mom. Thank you. The moral of our story was clear. True wealth isn't what you gather for yourself, but the legacy of truth and protection you leave for those who follow. The greatest treasure a grandmother can give isn't found in a box, but in the courage to do what is right, no matter the cost.